see higher up, you'll see different types of plants than you'd see lower down. And to avoid just a sort of melange of confusing plants thrown in here, what we can do is use what are called upland ecological zones, or upland life zones, they're also known as. And these are zones in which you find different assemblages of plants, different ecologies. So you have the lowland zone, which generally is below 350 meters. Now these numbers on here apply generally to the latitudes of round about the Wicklow Mountains. So those kind of latitudes. So you have the lowland zone below 350 meters, submontane zone 350 to 650, the montane zone 650 to 8, and the high montane zone above 800 meters. And these zone boundaries will vary with changes in latitude and exposure to harsher weather. So the zone boundaries will lower with increasing latitude, the more north you go, effectively. So in Ireland, for example, if you were down, say, in the Knockmeal Downs, then these zones may be slightly higher, so that the lowland zone might go up to 400 meters, the submontane zone might go up to 700 or 750 meters. And you may find down in that part of the world, you don't find any plants in the montane or the high montane zone at all. And the further north and west you go, the lower these boundaries become. So when you get to Connemara or Donegal, you're going to find that maybe the lowland zone disappears completely. And you've got plants in Connemara, for example, you're starting off in the submontane zone almost in some places. And then large parts of the north and west will be in the montane zone. And then the further north you go again into, say, up into the northwest of Scotland, up into Torridon or those parts of Scotland up there, then you've got much more of the high montane zone, and that will come much lower. Brendan, can you mute your mic, please?
Sorry, yeah, okay. Yeah. Excuse me.
That'll drop down, the high montane zone boundary will then drop into lower latitude. So you'll see more of those high montane types of flora. So what we're going to do is look at each one of these 4 zones individually and then see what we might see. And what I've done is, because I could have put up hundreds of slides and you'd have been bored to tears before very long. So what I've done is I've picked those plants that I think you are likely to come across, or some of the plants that you are likely to come across in your travels in the mountains, so that you've got a good chance of recognizing some of these things. So in the lowland zone, what we've got is areas of human management with enclosed farmland, and that means like upland hill farms. So you'll have fences, you'll have walls, you'll have rough grazing, and these might possibly be wildflower-rich areas. So there may be wildflowers present in these areas. And you might well find also in these areas, you'll find broadleaf trees, notably ash, oak and birch. And these trees will be either bounding these areas, or they'll be in small woods and things like that in this type of environment. One particularly important environment within the lowland zone is ancient woodland. And where there is ancient woodland, and by ancient woodland generally defined as woodland that's existed since the year 1600, so at least for 400 years. So that isn't much of that left, as you can imagine, okay? But where you do get it, you get very diverse ecological environments. And in Ireland, they can be described as temperate rainforests. And here you've got lots of lichens, ferns, mosses and liverworts. You find those predominating in these temperate rainforests. There aren't many left in Ireland, but I know, for example, around even very close to, people walk down along in Glendalough, and they walk along. Those of you familiar with Glendalough the Lara forest up on the left-hand side there is actually part of that is a temperate rainforest, and you get lots of these sort of mosses growing in the trees, and you get epiphytes, which are plants that live on the trees but don't parasitize them. They don't take any of the nutrients out of the trees. They just use the trees as structure for support. And you can see these epiphytes in terms of ferns and mosses and things living on the trees there. And temperate rainforest is quite rare habitat. So you find it in Ireland, parts of the northwest of the UK, northwestern USA, Japan, southern Norway, southeastern Australia, parts of Tasmania, and New Zealand is a very strong area for it. But for large parts of the world, that does not exist. So it's quite a rare habitat. And sadly, in Ireland, it's been cut down for various reasons, charcoal making or whatever in the past. So there's very few patches of it left. But those folks that live within shouting distance of Glendalough and can get there, the woods along the south slopes of Glendalough, north facing in other words, are to all intents and purposes temperate rainforests, and as a result they're protected, heavily protected by law. So what might we see? Well, this is a sort of typical enclosed grassland. So this is sort of a bit of pasture. In this case there's some soft rush. That's that spiky plant there, that's a rush. It's called soft rush, and it grows quite widely all over Ireland and the UK, and it's fairly a good indicator of damp ground. So if you see soft rush, then you don't want to get wet feet, then maybe avoid that particular patch. And in this case, what's growing with it here is a plant called the cuckoo flower, and you'll see cuckoo flower quite a lot. It's quite common. And it flowers in the spring. That's why it's called the cuckoo flower, because it sort of comes out at the same time as the cuckoo appears. And it's also called lady's smock. And there it is. That's the lovely sort of softy pink, pale pink flowers of the cuckoo flower. And we hardly notice it in the sward, in the grass, for most of the year round, but pops up in the spring. And it's a nice bright bit of colour early in the year. So next spring, have a look out for that one when you're walking around, cuckoo flower or lady's smock. And what I'm going to do here, guys, is I'm going to avoid the Latin names, okay? Because it's just, there's no mileage in that. I don't think you're going to remember those. So though the common names vary from place to place and in different parts of the country, there's some of you from Kerry and Cork there who maybe call this something different to the people that come from Donegal, and that's fine. And it does have they do have a lot of different names in different parts of the country, but we'll stick with the English names of these plants. Okay, so that's cuckoo flower, and we find it in those pastures. Another thing we might find in this sort of area, another spring flower, is stitchwort. This is greater stitchwort. There's two of them, one with a bigger flower than the other. This is greater stitchwort, slightly larger flower, maybe a couple of centimeters across. And this is quite common in the hedgerows. So this would be found around these woodland fields in the springtime there. So we can look out for those as well. Stitchwort. There's a greater and lesser. The greater one is more common. So easier to spot in the spring, so looking out for that one. Primroses. Everybody knows primroses, don't they? And everybody likes primroses, beautiful plants, and they'll come up in woodland, open woodland rather than very enclosed woodland. And we'll see those in meadows as well, along with cowslips, which I haven't put up, but cowslips again you would see, as well as primroses at this time in the spring in these sort of meadows. And a lot of the meadow flowers are spring flowers, so they tend to come up in the springtime rather than later in the year. This is one called sheep's bit. Sheep's bit likes a drier grassland environment, so you'll find this. You won't find this in damp meadows, but you'll find it in drier meadows. You'll also find it growing out of walls. You're more likely to see it growing out of walls that surround these areas. So this one was taken in Glendersan, which is up towards the old mine workings, and so a dry wall in that part of the Wicklow Mountains there. So you might see that one. But this one is a later flowerer, so this one's kind of late summer flowering. So that's something that comes a bit later in the year. Something to look out for as well. And ragged robin, obvious reasons for its name, because the flowers petals look torn and ragged, and this tends to grow slightly in damper areas. So damper meadows, you might find this growing around, or margins of meadows. And this is not uncommon either, this particular plant. You might see that one in your travels. A high summer, I think that one. I think that's a summer flowering plant. And then we've got, I think it's worth spending a bit of time just thinking about these temperate rainforests. So this is what it kind of looks like, what a temperate rainforest looks like. So you've got heavy, dense moss underfoot. If you walk through this, and I'm sure you have, it's very spongy when you walk through them. There's a lot of moss growing and covering the rocks in these environments. And then the trees we can see on the left, these are birch trees. So we've got birch trees on the left, and the larger tree growing on the right, I think might be an oak. Can't be sure, but that might be an oak tree by the bark. It's a bit hard to tell from here. But we've also got ferns growing in these areas. Very common to find ferns and lots of mosses. So bryophytes, very common to find bryophytes. That's the moss family, and ferns. Yeah, and if you notice on the branches and trunks of these trees, there's a lot of greenery. So there's mosses and lichens and liverworts growing on the barks of these trees. So this is an indicator that this is an ancient environment. That these trees might not look very big, but they've been there a long time. So they're slow growing because of the environment in which they're growing in, and so they've had plenty of time for these bark to be colonized by these various epiphytes. So what might you see in this environment? Well, bracken, it's common. Then also other clumpy ferns like this one, which is broad buckler fern. And there are quite a lot of different fern species in Ireland. I've always found them quite hard to ID. So there's recently a really good book come out, which I purchased recently. So I'm playing my way through that, and I'll be taking it out with me when I get out into the hills next to try and ID some of them. But certainly this one's quite, it forms these dense clumps that you see growing along the side of paths and tracks in the woodland. And often as not with buckler fern, you'll see that it's been eaten by deer, so it gets quite nibbled. You get the fronds get nibbled by deer. There are other ones that are similar to this, like lady's fern and other types of male fern is another one. So there's three main ones, but this is the most common, so this is the most likely one you're going to see. Then you might well see this one. This is called hard fern. This is also quite common, hard fern, and it looks very different, a bit smaller. And that's quite a common plant you'll see in woodlands and on woodland rides. That picture was taken on the Wicklow Way, just above the Glendalough Hotel on the Brocker side of the hill, so in the forest there, in the pine wood there. So quite common, that little fella. And that hart's tongue fern, you might well see this one, you might well know this one, and that's another one that's very common. So there's three starter ones anyway to be looking out for in these sort of woodland environment. Lots of mosses, huge number of different types of mosses. I thought feather moss. Yeah, you see a lot of feather moss in these woodlands. So I'll look up feather moss, and there are a dozen or more common species of feather moss. So just that one type of moss. So there's loads of different ones, but this one you might well be able to spot more easily because it's the red-stemmed feather moss. So you have this kind of pale citrusy yellow fronds on the moss, and then the stems in the middle of the fronds quite red in color. So it does stand out. So you will, you know, and all year round you'll see that one. So you can look out for that one when you next get up into the woods. See if you can spot that one. And of course, star moss, which I'm sure you already know. Star moss is very, very common. And it forms clumps, roundy clumps, big, soft, roundy clumps, and can grow as much as 40 centimeters tall over the years. So it's the tallest growing moss in Ireland and forms these big, soft clumps that you see in open woodland or on forest rides in the coniferous woodland. And all these plants really we've looked at tend to prefer acid conditions, acid soil conditions, which is not surprising given that in the woodlands most of the soils are acid around our mountain areas. So if we move on up into the submontane zone, and the submontane zone in this instance is about 350 to 650 meters. So that would take us up to you know, the moderate sized hills you might be walking in Ireland. And I would imagine for a lot of us, this is the area we spend most of our time in, walking in this area here. So this would be like Brocha Mountain in the Wicklow Hills, or Knockmill down in the south, some of the lower hills around Killarney National Park. And in this area, what we're finding is we've got hill grassland. So it's just kind of little patches of grassland that we find on the open hillsides, very often grazed by deer, aren't they? These open patches, deer seem to congregate there because it's a little bit of grass. And you'll get dry or wet heath, which is essentially heather. Patches of big expanses of dry heath we have, which is this sort of heathery ground that we're very familiar with. And where the ground gets a bit wetter, the heathland becomes slightly different in the plants. And we might find scrubby trees, and we might find some shrubs, scrubby trees and shrubs as well growing in this area. So dry heath is typified by heather species. We're all familiar with heather in Ireland, I'm sure. Bilberries, we're familiar with bilberry as well. Rough grasses and sedges, and these kind of predominate in dry heath. And when it gets wetter, and we get kind of wet patches, maybe in a little hollow or something like that, a little saddle or a wetter patch, then we're going to find bog asphodel, sundew, butterwort, bog pimpernel, cotton grasses. That's the big fluffy. We're going to look at all of these in a minute. And this habitat will be interspersed with and gradually grade into blanket bog. So blanket bog is like a wet habitat in this zone that's gone, you know, that's very, very wet. So it changes, it's changes even more. And the scrubby trees we find generally are on crags where grazing is not possible. And for that reason, it's often called ledge veg, for that reason. And you'll find scrub willows, you might find bog myrtle, some rowans, maybe hawthorn, perhaps juniper. And the reason why we don't see a lot of this in this zone is because of grazing, because the mountains are heavily grazed by sheep in the summer and by deer all year round. So so a lot of this environment this zone, if you like, is still quite heavily influenced by man. So what might we see? Well, heathers. There's three main heather species that we find. Ling, which is the one on the left of the picture. You see the little purpley flowers running up and all the way up the stem. That's very indicative of ling. You get this continuous line of flowers running up the stem. And this will flower through the summer and into the early autumn. So it's from July really onwards, but comes into its own probably in August is when it's flowering at its best. And this is one that covers the Irish hills in the purple heather and leads to much folk songs sung about it. And the bottom right is bell heather. And bell heather is often found along with ling, and it's the flowers are like little bells held on the end of the spikes, on the top of the spikes, and has this deep cerise pink, almost red colour, very distinctive when you see it. And it flowers a bit earlier in the year, so that'll come out earlier. Might even be, definitely will be flowering now when we get up there. We'll be able to see that. That sort of starts around about May time. In clumps, in sort of little shrubby, bushy clumps. And then the top right, we have cross-leaved heath. And again, it's got these sort of bell-shaped flowers that are stuck at the top of stems. But in this case, they're much more straggly stems. Really quite sort of sickly looking plants. They're kind of almost a turquoisey green colour. They don't look like a typical healthy bushy plant. And this plant tends to predominate in damp conditions. So when it gets a bit too damp for bell heather and for ling to grow, you'll be finding this cross-leaved heath. And there's the three ones you'll see a lot in the hills. We also find bilberry. We're all familiar with bilberry, I'm sure. And if you've not tasted bilberry straight off the plant in the mountains, then you're missing something. So look out for them in August. Give yourself a treat. Find some bilberries, sit down and have a little graze. They're really nice. And we might find some other plants mixed in this area. Milkwort is one of my wee favourites. This is a tiny wee plant, milkwort. But it's got this beautiful, beautiful blue flowers, and they're so small, they're almost like you just catch them in the corner of your eye as you're walking along, walking the hillsides. And this beautiful, delicate, when you get a close-up, there's this really lovely, delicate little flower. Milkwort can range anything from white through pink to mauve, but predominantly you find it in blue. But you can see other colour forms as well. And it gets the name milkwort because it was believed that if you fed this to cattle and even to other critters, including humans, that they would encourage the lactating mothers to produce more milk. So if they weren't producing enough milk for their offspring, then by giving them milkwort to eat, it was believed that it would encourage production of milk. Now this is one you'll see an awful lot in this zone. This is This is Tomentil. It's one of the Potentilla family, and this one flowers right through the year. So it flowers from kind of April, May, all the way through to October. So we see it a lot, all the time. Tiny little 4-petaled flowers. It's the only Potentilla with 4 petals. All the rest have 5. And a wee story about this one is that there's an urban myth about this plant, in that its Latin name is Potentilla erecta, and as such, it was believed that somebody made the story up that if you ate this plant, that it acted as like nature's Viagra, which is total myth. It absolutely does nothing of the sort, but it's just someone got the Latin name and just made up a little story about it. This is bog asphodel, which is a gorgeous plant. Grows in wetter areas. So we're now moved into wetter heath, and this is what we'd see in wetter heath. This is a little wet patch on the side of the sugarloaf. So don't have to go too far to find this stuff. And this flowers late summer into the autumn, and usually quite in little sporadic patches, but in this case, quite a big clump of it. It's these gorgeous yellow flowers, and if you look really closely and get really close to them, the detail is astonishing. So get up close and personal with bog asphodel. It's really worth it. Lovely little plant. One you might be more familiar with is lousewort. It's little purple flowers you see dotted around the hills in the spring. Has this rather peculiar shape, but it also comes in a white form on the right hand side there, so you might look out for the white form of lousewort. Believed to relieve lice. So don't know. If any of you are unfortunate enough to be afflicted by lice, then maybe you can try it and let us know the result. This is one of my absolute all-time favourite weed plants. This is bog pimpernel. And most of the time, it's these tiny little heart-shaped leaves, literally 2 or 3 millimeters across, are totally inconspicuous in the boggy areas. But then in the spring, these beautiful little pink stripy cups, like little aprons, appear on this plant. These little cups, and it's the most delicate and beautiful thing. It really is. So try and see if you can spot that as well in boggier areas. It's not uncommon. It's not uncommon. So you've got a good chance of spotting it. Butterwort, yeah. I mean, we're all familiar with there's 3 parasitic plants in Ireland. One of them is a water plant called bladderwort, which eats invertebrates underwater. But the 2 land-based ones that we're very familiar with is butterwort. This chap here, you can see it's caught some insects on its sticky leaves. And the blue flower spike comes up in the summer. And these sort of yellowy butterworts can be seen all over the hillside in this zone. They like sort of sunnier aspects, so you're more likely to find them in slightly sheltered, sunnier spots than you are in more exposed areas. But they often, where they do grow, they often grow in big patches, because once they find the right environment to grow, then they grow in large numbers. And sundew, yeah, we're probably familiar with sundew as well, the little insectivorous plant with the sticky hairs on the outside of the leaves. This particular one is oblong leaf sundew, and this was taken in Connemara. So this was in one of the valleys in Connemara, where this one is quite common but is very rare elsewhere outside of that area. And it's sort of little spatula-shaped leaves rather than the more usual round ones that we'd be familiar with. So that's another one to look out for. If you're ever in Connemara, keep an eye out for that one. It's very common in Connemara. I often spot it when I'm out in the Man Turks or in the 12 Bends. These wet heaths can then grade into what we call blanket bog or mountain blanket bog. And blanket bogs are really important environments for invertebrates. And in Ireland, Ireland has 8% of the world's blanket bogs. It's a very rare type of environment in the whole world, and Ireland has 8% of the whole world's supply, for use of a better word, of blanket bog. So very much we should be protecting this stuff. I know we curse it if we have to cross it as hikers, but actually we should be very proud of what we have and nurture it, because it's a very, very important environment. And of course now it's also recognized it's a great carbon sink, so it soaks up carbon dioxide, and they also act as a great water sponge. So at times of high rainfall, they'll soak up the water and then they release it slowly, so we're less likely to get flooding downstream at times of high rainfall. And we should preserve what blanket bogs we've got left. I know there's a lot of turf cutting goes on this time of the year to people in the West particularly, and it's a tradition, and that's fine. However, we really shouldn't be cutting any fresh bogs these days. We should be trying to reinstate them rather than to be draining them. And you can see here on this picture, there's a lot less heather, isn't there? A lot less of the ling, and there's more mosses, there's more sedges. It doesn't look the same as the sort of dry environment we might walk across. It's a very different looking environment. It's very different plant assemblages. And in these sort of areas, you find cotton grass. And we have 2 main types of cotton grass in Ireland. We have common cotton grass on the left with multiple flower heads, and we have hare's tail cotton grass on the right with 1 flower head. So I know all know what cotton grass looks like and when you're walking in the hills. But next time, see if you can see which one it is. Is it common cotton grass or is it hare's tail cotton grass? Or are they mixed together? Do they interrelate? Interesting point. This one is less common. This is called bog rosemary. And there's nothing to do with rosemary at all. In fact, it's a member of the heather family. And this you find on very wet ground. It's locally common in certain areas. This picture is taken on the Liffey Head bog. And you can see the ground is very boggy around it. You've got sphagnum moss and a lot of water. Almost unrecognizable unless you really know what you're looking for until it flowers. And then you have these little pale pink heads of flowers in the spring again, or early summer, I think, early summer. And then it's quite recognizable on wet, boggy ground. But it's locally common, but generally quite a rare plant of Irish bogs. Lovely little plant. Then, of course, we've got sphagnum moss. And the bogs were made by sphagnum mosses. And sphagnum mosses are an incredible plant, an ancient plant. This is a stolen photo. You might notice that there's some photo library watermarks going through it, but I just couldn't resist this photo because it's just such a gorgeous picture. But there's a lot of different types of sphagnum mosses as well. But these sphagnum mosses build the bog by the action that they grow from the top of the plant. So the bottom of the plant dies off, the top keeps growing up. So gradually they build the bogs, and the plants will, as they decompose, they only semi-decompose, and then it gets compacted at the bottom of the bog, and they grow. The bogs increase at the rate of 1 millimeter a year. So if you see cut bogs, or you see peat hags where streams have cut through old peat, and it's 2 meters high, as tall as you are, which these peat hags are in places, that's 2,000 years of peat growth, of bog growth. So it takes a long time to grow a bog. And the sphagnum moss has a survival tactic of turning the water around itself acid, so that other plants can't thrive. So it's the sphagnum mosses that make the bogs acid, make the water acid. Yeah, beautiful. Sphagnum mosses. And there are lots and lots of different types of sphagnum mosses. I couldn't even begin to name them all, but they're red, yellow, green ones, all different types. But in this area now, you might find some trees. This is the ledge veg. I couldn't really find a decent picture of anything, but this is a rowan, mountain ash, growing out of a rocky ledge here. And this is a stock photo I took, so I don't even know where this is, to be honest, folks. But you can see there, obviously, in rowan, very distinctive red berries, which you see in the autumn. And if you go up somewhere like Glenmalure, then you'll see the rowan growing quite a lot in the rocky slopes around the side of Glenmalure. But yeah, you don't see many trees and shrubs in the Irish hills in this zone because of grazing. What are we doing, Julie? Ooh, time's getting on, isn't it? Let's move up a bit then into the montane zone. This is a bit higher up now. So we're getting to the zone would cover most of the mountaintops that we know in Ireland. And this would normally be the boundary of the natural tree line, and where climate starts to strongly influence the vegetation and the habitat that we see. We very rarely in Ireland, I don't think we do anywhere, have a natural tree line anymore. It's all been cut away. But the bottom of the montane zone would represent a natural tree line if there were one. And most of the species in this zone are of high conservation value, and many of them are very susceptible to human activity. So trampling, farming practices, other activities of us humans. So we need to be careful where we're walking when we're in this zone on hilltops, because we could be crunching these wee plants. So we need to stick to paths and things if we can. In some parts of Ireland, this is the southernmost extent of some Arctic alpine species. And they are very vulnerable to habitat change and vulnerable to global warming, and that's a big problem. So things like alpine club moss, which is locally spotted at higher levels. There's a few places in the Wicklow Mountains I know where you can find it, and certainly I'm sure you know in your own area where you might find alpine club moss, those of you who know the plants. But certainly there's the southern extent of some certain Arctic alpine species. So it's a very important environment for the ecology of Ireland. So this area is typified by high precipitation, high winds, low temperatures and low sunshine because it's cloudier more than it is elsewhere. So it's quite a challenging environmental zone for the plants to live in. So you're going to get an increase in dwarf growing forms because of the windy and cold conditions. So the wind it's wind pruning almost. So where there is heather and bilberry, they're often only a few centimetres high. When you see that on the top of hills like, I don't know, Tonlegee or other hills that you're familiar with that are in this zone, like Maquilla, you might find some ling and you might find some bilberry, but they might only just be hanging on by the skin of their teeth, just a few centimetres high, because the wind just keeps bashing them. And in this zone, you'll find plants that are adapted to this, like cowberry, crowberry and bearberry, alpine lady's mantle, the club mosses, dwarf willows, sedges, and the grasses change here to what's called mat grass or nardus. And you get an increase in the montane bryophyte species, which is mountain hardy mosses, effectively. So you get more moss appearing at these levels. So what does a sort of montane zone look like? Well, it looks a bit like this. And this is in the Mam Turks. So this is at about 600 meters, I would imagine, in the Mam Turks. But because we're north and west, that zone has dropped slightly. So it's dropped because we've gone further north and west. And this is a nice sunny day, clearly. But it isn't always. It can be quite exposed and windy and cold and wet, low sunshine levels in this area. I know the sunshine, it's always sunshines in Connemara, but sometimes it doesn't. And see how the vegetation is fairly sparse, but mixed in with the frost-shattered rock. So this is an area that's subjected to cold, wind. It's a really marginal habitat for a lot of plants. Certainly not going to get much in the way of heather growing up here. This might be ling down here on the bottom right. Some of that might be ling, but you're certainly going to find there's mosses in there as well. And maybe that sort of little green strip halfway up on the right-hand edge, that could be nardus grass there, possibly. So you kind of get patches of stuff growing like that. Certainly not verdant, not a word you could use for this area. And you're going to find things like alpine lady's mantle here. This is a dwarf form of the one you find more commonly growing in lower altitude. So alpine lady's mantle here growing away. And you're going to find things, this is fir club moss. So this is one of the more common club mosses. Not that any of them are common at all. And these generally grow above about 600 meters in Ireland. So when you start to see fir club mosses, you know you're in this montane environment. So it's a good indicator that you're in the montane zone when you start seeing club mosses. So keep an eye out for those. And I know we do find these in that very environment I showed you 2 slides back. In the Mam Turks, you see club mosses growing in clefts in the rock there. This is alpine club moss. And this one is a marginal plant, really, in Ireland. It's hanging on by the skin of its teeth, but hanging on it is. And you'll find this in parts of the Lugnaquilla Plateau. You'll find it on Kipua Mountain. And you find it on Tonlegee. So on the higher points in the Wicklow Mountains, you'll find it, quite a lot of it down higher up in the Reeks, around by the Big Gun. I've seen it around there. I do remember it there, quite a lot of it there. So not no Piesta down there as well. So you're going to find this type of plant. So if you come across alpine club moss, this sort of looking plant in your travels, and then Try to avoid treading on it, guys, because it's struggling to stay around us, stay around in Ireland. And global warming is not going to help. This you'll see a lot of deer grass, very common plant of the montane zone, and a bit lower down as well. Clearly, these things, there's a sort of, they grade in one into the other. You know, there's a sort of gradation clearly between one into the other. So there's not a sort of line drawn on the side of a mountain where the zone begins and ends. But deer grass with this kind of distinctive round quill-like leaves, very distinctive plant with a little sort of brown flower spike on the end. Often you can find it if you're walking in heavily walked areas, you'll find it's quite tough, but the clumps can sometimes be worn away in the middle by boots. So it looks a little bit like a tonsured monk. There's just this brown patch in the middle with all this frondy quills of green around the side of it. This is nardus. Now this is the mat grass. Now, you know, you'd be hard pressed to recognize it, and I wouldn't expect that you would, but this is the kind of environment in which you'd find this. So we're on a fairly high mountainside here, fairly windswept, fairly barren, but we do have grasses in patches, and this is the type of grassland that we would get. So you get deer grazing it, and maybe upland sheep, but it's fairly tough old stuff for them to eat. This is cowberry, very low shrub, just a few centimeters high, and has these little red berries on it, and these glossy dark green leaves. You know, this glossy leaves like this to protect the plant, protect the leaves. They're not delicate leaves at all. They're very tough, leathery, glossy leaves to protect them from the wind and the cold and the freezing as well. And mixed in with that, we'll find crowberry. This one is quite common as well at certain altitudes. So crowberry again, the sort of tough little leaves it has. These are the black fruits of crowberry. Quite common plant you'll find higher up. So again, you know you're in the montane zone when you see crowberry. And this is dwarf willow, also called least willow. For the fact that it's only a centimetre or two above the ground, and it has these little round leaves, probably 2 to 3 centimetres across, this is a willow tree. And this is a dwarf growing willow, and it sticks very close to the ground, and it's a real marginal here. It's really hanging on in this really difficult environment. And this one extends right up into the montane zone, the high montane zone, dwarf willow. I've seen it in the island. I can't think where now, but you'll see it. You'll be in the higher, more exposed parts for sure, where this fella lives. But look out for that one. And then when we get up into the high montane zone, we're getting into a really difficult environment now. Now, I put here this environment is not found in Ireland, but it might be rarely found. You might find it in 1 or 2 spots, very high up and exposed faces. North-facing hills, high up, maybe in Donegal, maybe down in Kerry. But see, Kerry's high, but a bit far south. So there's nowhere in the Wicklow Mountains in this zone. Not really, not even the top of Lugnaquilla. But it's definitely, I mean, we don't want to miss it out as a zone. We need to sort of include it in our little talk here. But you would find this in the highlands of Scotland, and particularly the Cairngorms. So this is very typical high montanes like the Cairngorm Mountains or high up on Ben Nevis, those side of environments. If you get there, which I'm sure you will, I'm sure many of you have been up there. And it's equivalent to, on the global alpine scale, and I didn't go into the global alpine scale, but it's equivalent, this high montane zone is equivalent to the mid-alpine zone of the sort of continental alpine system. And be similar to the sort of environments found in Greenland. So it's quite a tough environment for plants to live in. And it's typified by late lying snow. So you've got snow lying late into the year. And it's also very sensitive to changes in the environment and global warming for obvious reasons. As the climate warms up, then these zones will disappear completely from some parts. if there is any high montane zone in Ireland anywhere, the chances are that with global warming, it won't be there for very long. And then here you'll find alpine species. So some of the species we definitely saw in the montane zone, like the dwarf willow, you'll definitely find up here. You might find the alpine lady's mantle, one or two other things. You definitely find the club mosses up here. But in addition, you'll find some unusual stuff like dwarf azalea and Racemitrium. And Racemitrium, there's a zone they call Racemitrium Heath, which is like where the only vegetation that there is predominantly Racemitrium moss. And we'll look at that. Mat grasses again, stiff sedge, which is a high altitude sedge, and then high altitude growing mosses and liverworts. So it's a very tough environment. Snow lying a lot of the year, very cold, very windy. The plants have to deal with the water in the form of ice for a good part of the year. So for a good part of the year, the only water is frozen, solid. So, so they really had to have special adaptations for that. And what does it look like? Well, like that. That's the Cairngorm Plateau in spring. So that's your high montane zone. So you've got snow lying in hollows and gullies on lead and in gullies and hollows, and then you've got a lot of rock, very sparse vegetation, very sparse. It's a really difficult environment to survive. But you do have things. I photographed quite a lot of dwarf azalea on the Cairngorm Plateau. It's amazing what you can find up there, flowering away, lovely little pink flowers, quite astonishing. Here it is, Australian azalea. This is taken on the Cairngorm Plateau a few years ago now. And notice on the far right and popping through on the left a little bit, this furry looking brown furry thing. That's Racemitrium moss, or it's also the English name is woolly fringe moss. And this is a moss it's adapted to growing in very alien or difficult environments. So it's adapted to high altitude environments. So it thrives in cold, windy, exposed environments. And the woolly bit of it, that protects it. Those bits are protecting the core of the plant from the cold wind. They're acting like insulation. They're trying to trap air inside the plant. So there it is as a clump. So you've got Racemitrium there, and it's kind of protecting itself by like almost this coat of woolly fronds, if you like, to trap air inside the plant. Try and create a micro environment inside itself that that its core doesn't get frozen and desiccated. Desiccation is a big problem in these altitudes. There's a few other plants in this picture that have been blasted by the winter. You can see these little brown lumps of things here. Really blasted environment. A few little mosses hanging on there in a few places. It's a tough place. And then we'll find a lot of lichen as well up in this area. So lichens are very common at all altitudes, but they will predominate in the montane zone, because the high montane zone, because there's little soil. What soil there is gets blown away or washed away very quickly. So there's a lot of bare rock. And in this picture, there's two of the three main types of lichens. You've got what they call crustose lichens, and the crustose ones are like crusts on the rock surface. So this is this grey, greeny one on the bottom left. That's crustose lichen. And then you've got what's called foliose, because it has looks a bit like foliage. And that's this flaky one here on the grey, light grey one on the top right. And the third main type of lichens are called fruticose. And that covers a big range, everything from reindeer moss to old man's beard that you see hanging off of trees. They're sort of lichens that hang off tree branches at lower altitudes, to the sort of devil's matchsticks, to the pixie cups as well. Those little pixie cup lichens, or the little red dots of devil's matchsticks you see, they're all fruticose lichens. So there's the main three groups of lichens. Fascinating plants. Could do a whole lecture on lichens. They're amazing things. Really interesting, but I'm not going to go into that now because we're running out of time, folks. And this is stiff sedge. That's what it looks like, and it's in a marginal environment, so it's really struggling there. A lot of it's already died, isn't it? It's brown and it's flowering away there. It's trying to reproduce.